After my wife died, my daughter stripped me of everything. The house, the savings, the truck I had driven for 14 years. She handed me an envelope with $52 inside and told me the cabin in the mountains was all that was left. I walked 3 miles up a gravel road in the dark with one suitcase and a pocket watch my mother had pressed into my hand the week before she died. She had whispered 5 words I did not understand then. Wind it when you're ready. That night, sitting on the floor of her abandoned workshop with no electricity and no reason to believe tomorrow would be any different, I wound it. And the back panel clicked open. I am so grateful you are here with me today. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are watching from. Your country, your city. I would love to know. It means everything to see this community grow. A quick note. This story contains fictional elements crafted for storytelling purposes. My name is Harold Arthur Bennett. I am 71 years old. I spent 35 years as a licensed plumber in Dayton, Ohio, crawling under houses and reading pipe systems the way some people read books. And if you want to understand how a man can lose everything he spent a lifetime building in less than 3 weeks, the story begins with a cup of tea that went cold. I woke at 4:15 that Friday morning. The house carried the particular silence it always held before dawn. Not empty. Just waiting. I moved through the dark kitchen without turning on the lights because I had not needed to in 42 years. My hands knew every cabinet, every drawer, every corner of that counter where Margaret kept the tea tin beside the stove. I filled the kettle. I set out 2 cups. I had always made 2. Margaret and I met in 1982. She was the office secretary at a construction company where I had been brought in to replumb an entire second floor. She handed me the wrong permit on my first morning, realized the mistake before I did, chased me down the hallway with the correct one, and said, "You would have figured it out eventually," but I did not feel like waiting. We were married 11 months later, 42 years. 2 houses. 1 daughter. A retirement we had spent the last decade sketching on paper napkins at the kitchen table after dinner. Margaret wanted watercolor classes. She had bought the set already. A wooden box with 48 colors, still wrapped in plastic on the shelf. I wanted to rebuild the front porch of a cottage we had looked at once in the Shenandoah Valley. We had a route planned, no planes. Just the truck and whatever roads felt right. Lung cancer does not negotiate. 20 months since the diagnosis. In those months, the watercolor box and the road trips became things we mentioned, but stopped scheduling. There is a kind of grief that begins before the loss. I had been living inside that grief for nearly 2 years. What arrived that Friday morning was something else entirely. Heavier. And strangely quieter. I carried the second cup to the kitchen table where Margaret liked to sit mornings, the chair closest to the window where she could watch the birds at the feeder she had hung 3 summers ago. The lamp was on. She always turned it on before I woke because chemotherapy had made sleeping through the night difficult, and she preferred tea and a book to lying in the dark. Her book was open on the table. She was wearing the green wool cardigan I had given her 2 Christmases ago. The one she said was a size too large and wore every day anyway. Her cup was beside her hand. The tea had gone cold. Her chest was not moving. I stood there for a moment that had no real length to it. Both very long and over immediately. Then I set the second cup on the table beside hers, walked to the phone, and called 911. I gave our address clearly. I said I would leave the front door unlocked. My voice was steady in the way that voices sometimes are when the rest of you has not caught up. The body keeps doing what it knows. The hands keep working. Somewhere underneath, something fundamental has already shifted, but you do not feel it yet because the surface is still holding. I went back and sat down beside her. I took her hand. It was cool but not cold. I held it with both of mine and did not say anything because there was nothing in the language I knew that was adequate for that chair, that window, that cup of tea she would never drink. That was March 7th. 2024. My mother, Vivian, had passed 8 months before Margaret. 89 years old. Gone the way she had lived, on her own terms, and without much noise. Margaret had been standing beside me at the graveside in Briar Hollow, Virginia, in a light rain that soaked you before you noticed. She held my arm and said nothing, because she understood there was nothing useful to say. She just stayed. I thought about that, sitting at the kitchen table next to Margaret's cold tea, listening to the ambulance outside. Karen arrived 3 days later with her husband, Troy. My daughter is 42. She is a certified public accountant in Charlotte, North Carolina. Precise, efficient, the kind of person who enters a crisis and immediately organizes it into labeled folders. Troy runs a contracting business. Together they handled the calls, the arrangements, the neighbors who arrived with food. I sat in the living room and said the things people say in those rooms, and I was genuinely grateful they were there. On the 4th day, Karen sat across from me at the kitchen table with a folder. The same table. The same chair. "Dad," she said, "I need you to sign a few things. General power of attorney. Standard estate management. It lets Troy and me handle the paperwork so you do not have to deal with any of it right now." I looked at the pages. 4 of them. The language on page 3 was dense. With legal terms my eyes moved across without traction. I had not slept more than 8 hours total since Friday. My hands carried a tremor I could not stop. Karen placed a pen on the table. I signed. I want to be precise about this. I am not a careless man. 35 years of plumbing taught me to check every connection before turning on the water. The signature I put on those pages was not the signature of someone who does not pay attention. It was the signature of a man who was 4 days past, finding his wife at their kitchen table with a cup of cold tea, and who trusted the person across from him completely. That distinction would matter later. I have thought about it many times since. That night I went to bed in the room Margaret and I had shared for 9 years. Her reading glasses were folded on the nightstand, exactly where she always left them. I did not touch them. I opened the drawer on my side. Inside was a brass pocket watch, small, heavier than it looked, its surface smooth from decades of handling. Vivian had pressed it into my hand 5 days before she died. In the hospital room in Charleston, after asking me to close the door, "Keep the..." I had almost asked what she meant. By the time I thought to, her eyes had already closed. She passed 3 days later at 2:40 in the morning. I got the call at 3:17. Too late to be there. I set the watch on Margaret's nightstand beside her glasses and turned off the lamp. I did not know yet what I had just signed. I did not know Karen had already known. Before I tell you what my daughter laid out 3 weeks later at that same kitchen table, I need to explain what had been happening for the 18 months before it. What she presented that morning did not come from nowhere. It was the end of a process, and I was the person who had made it possible. One signature at a time. In plumbing, a slow leak does more damage than a burst pipe. A burst pipe is dramatic. Water everywhere. You see it, you shut the valve, you fix it. A slow leak is different. It works behind the wall where you cannot hear it. By the time you notice the stain on the ceiling, the damage has been accumulating for months. The structure is already compromised. That is what those 18 months were. A slow leak I never heard. Over that 1.5 years, while Margaret was moving through chemotherapy cycles that left her thin and quiet in ways I was still learning to navigate, Karen had come to me 4 separate times with paperwork. Each time she described it as routine estate planning, keeping documents current, protecting assets, standard procedure for a couple our age with a house and some retirement income. Each time, I signed without reading carefully. I need you to understand why. My days during that period were divided between driving Margaret 40 minutes to the treatment center, sitting in waiting rooms that smelled of floor cleaner and quiet fear, and learning enough about her medication combinations to hold an informed conversation with her oncologist. I tracked her white cell counts the way I used to track water pressure readings, with a notebook and a pencil, and a level of attention that left nothing over for anything else. I had nothing left for dense legal language and documents my own daughter brought me and described as routine. I trusted her completely. That is the whole of it. What I did not understand, and what I have since reconstructed from the documents themselves, is that Karen had been building a structure, one page at a time. The way you build anything that is meant to hold weight, quietly, in sequence, each piece supporting the next. The first document established a family living trust, a legitimate estate planning tool. Families use them routinely. Nothing unusual about the instrument itself. Karen explained it at the kitchen table in 10 minutes. I signed it between Margaret's Tuesday treatment and her Thursday blood draw. The second transferred our house from joint ownership into that trust, with Karen and Troy named as co-trustees. All decisions about trust assets now required their approval. I signed that one on a Sunday afternoon. Margaret was sleeping in the next room. The television was on low. I remember the sound of it more clearly than I remember reading the page. The third amended the trust to include our financial accounts. Our joint checking, the only account Margaret and I had ever maintained, because 42 years of marriage had made separate finances feel unnecessary. I signed it in the hospital parking lot. Karen had driven down specifically. She said she did not want to bother me at home. The fourth was the general power of attorney I had signed 4 days after Margaret died. The one that gave Karen direct authority to act on my behalf in any financial matter without further approval from me. Each step had looked reasonable in isolation. Each one had been presented at a moment when my attention was entirely somewhere else. Together, they were a complete transfer of control. By the day Margaret passed, every significant asset we owned had been moved into that trust. My signature was on every page. I spent 35 years crawling under houses, mapping systems that other people could not see from above. I could tell you where every pipe ran, where every joint connected, where the pressure was building, and where it would eventually fail. I read hidden systems for a living. I did not read this one, not because I could not, because I did not look. Because the person who built it was my daughter, and I believed her the way you believe the ground under your feet. You do not test it. You do not inspect it. You simply stand on it and trust that it will hold. In plumbing, we call that an uninspected system. And uninspected systems are the ones that fail. I have replayed each of those 4 signatures many times. Not with anger. Not yet. Anger came later. What I felt first was something more mechanical. The recognition of a pattern I should have seen. 4 visits. 4 documents. 4 moments chosen with precision. Each one arriving when my capacity was at its lowest, when my hands were full of Margaret's medication schedule and my head was full of numbers that had nothing to do with money. Karen is a certified public accountant. She reads financial structures the way I read pipe systems. She knows how things connect. She knows what happens when you move one number from one column to another. She would have understood exactly what she was building. I set the pocket watch on Margaret's nightstand that night and looked at it for a while. 6 small numbers were engraved on the back, in handwriting that was slightly uneven, pressed carefully rather than quickly. I had assumed they were a date, an anniversary perhaps. During Margaret's treatments, I had not given them more thought than that. I turned off the lamp and lay in the dark in a house where nothing belonged to me anymore, though I did not know that yet. The documents had been signed. The system was already pressurized. I simply had not turned on the water to find out where it leaked. That understanding was coming. And when it arrived, it would arrive at a kitchen table, in a folder, presented by my daughter, with the efficiency of someone closing an account. 3 weeks after we buried Margaret, Karen called a family meeting. She used those exact words. Family meeting. The way an accountant uses words. Precisely and with purpose. They arrived at 9 in the morning, both dressed as though they were going to a professional appointment. Karen wore a blazer. Troy had on a pressed button-down. They placed folders on the dining table before they sat down. I noticed the folders before I noticed much else. There were 3 of them. Color-coded. Tabbed. I made coffee. Nobody asked for any. I made it anyway, because I needed something to do with my hands. In plumbing, when you are about to open a system you suspect is compromised, you prepare your tools first. You lay everything out. You check your fittings. You make sure the shutoff valve is within reach. I did not have a shutoff valve that morning. I had a coffee pot and 2 hands that still carried a tremor. Karen opened the first folder and called it an estate review. She walked through each item the way she walked through everything. Measured pace. Level tone. The rhythm of someone reading a balance sheet aloud. The house. Placed in the family living trust 18 months earlier. Karen and Troy as co-trustees. No action needed on my part. Our joint checking account. The only account Margaret and I had ever maintained because 4 decades of marriage had made separate finances feel like a question that did not need asking. Transferred to the trust operating account. Managed by Karen. My pension from plumbing. Modest. 3 union shops over 35 years. None long enough for a full benefit. Those payments deposited directly into our joint account. Social Security deposited into the same account. Karen had not needed to redirect either income source. She controlled the account where both of them landed. My small side work, residential repairs for a handful of longtime clients after retirement, suspended on liability grounds during the estate process. The truck I had owned for 14 years. Troy needed it for a job site in the near term. Temporary. I sat through all of it. I let her finish. I watched her move through each line item with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed this presentation. Or perhaps had simply lived with these numbers long enough that they no longer required rehearsal. Troy sat beside her and contributed nothing. His eyes moved between the table and the window. They did not land on me. When she finished, I asked the only question I had left. What is left for me? Karen checked her notes. The answer was ready, which told me she had anticipated the question. She mentioned Vivian's property in Briar Hollow, Virginia. A frame house, older construction, sitting on about 2.5 acres at the end of a county road. $21,000 in past due property taxes. Last assessed value below the outstanding liability. Essentially worthless. Dad, it is a debt, not an asset. I looked at the table for a moment. The wood grain ran in long parallel lines from one end to the other. Margaret had picked this table out at an estate sale 11 years ago. She had sanded it herself and sealed it with 3 coats of polyurethane and told me it was the best $40 she had ever spent. I will take the house. Something shifted in Karen's expression. Not much. She was too practiced for that. But enough. A brief pause before the response. The kind of pause that happens when a number lands in the wrong column. If that is what you want. Troy had not spoken during the meeting. He spoke less after that. When I said I would take the house, he was looking at the table. And he kept looking at it. That evening, after they left, I walked through each room of what I had already begun calling Karen's house. 9 years of living. Pressed into those walls. Margaret's coat still on the hook by the front door. A stack of library books on the kitchen counter she had not finished. Her watercolor box on the shelf in the spare room, the plastic still on it. The brushes still in their paper sleeves. I stood at that shelf for a while. I had spent 35 years understanding how plumbing systems fail. From the outside, a house can look perfectly sound, while the pipes behind the walls are corroded through. The failure looks sudden to anyone watching. It never actually is. It is the accumulation of every joint that was not inspected. Every fitting that was not tightened. Every document signed without reading the specification. I was beginning to understand what kind of failure this was. 18 months of individual steps, each one reasonable in isolation, each one part of a system I had never seen drawn on a single page. I turned off the light and went to bed in a house where nothing belonged to me anymore. Not on paper. Not according to anything I had signed. I went to sleep thinking about a worn wooden house in the Virginia mountains with $21,000 of back taxes. Every person in that room had written it off without a second thought. My mother had lived there for 55 years. She had tended a garden and repaired watches and said less than she knew. I fell asleep wondering if they were right about the house. Something in my chest, quiet and unformed, suggested they were not. I stayed in Karen's house for 2 more weeks. That is what I called it in my head. Karen's house. The adjustment took about 6 hours. There is a particular quality to a place where you are no longer fully welcome. Nothing dramatic. No locked doors or raised voices. Just the way conversation stops when you enter a room. The way a brochure for a retirement community appears on the kitchen counter on a Tuesday morning, positioned casually. The way things are positioned when someone wants you to notice them without having to say anything directly. Troy asked me twice about my housing plans. He used those exact words, housing plans, the kind of phrase that creates distance while sounding practical. I answered both times the same way. I was still thinking it through. That was true as far as it went. What I was actually doing was taking inventory, not of what I was losing. I had done that arithmetic at the kitchen table 3 weeks earlier. What I was doing was more specific. I was figuring out what I could carry. Margaret and I had combined our finances completely in the first year of marriage. 1 joint checking account. 1 set of bills. 1 household budget I updated every Sunday evening at the kitchen table. We never discussed it after the first year. It simply became the way things worked. The logic had always been sound. We were 1 household, 1 financial unit. Over 42 years, that logic served us without a single problem. The problem was that I now had no separate account. No savings under my name alone. The only cash I had access to was what happened to be in my wallet at the moment. Karen transferred our joint account into the trust. $52 and some coins. The last bill before that had gone to the hospital gift shop. Margaret had wanted a small bunch of daisies in a paper sleeve, because the room needed something alive. $52. I looked that number up against the Greyhound website on the library computer 1 block from Karen's house. Dayton to Staunton, Virginia, the nearest major stop to Briar Hollow. The fare was $52. I stared at that screen for a long time. I do not have a precise word for what I felt. Not comfort exactly. More like a confirmation I had not known I was waiting for. In plumbing, there is a moment during a pressure test when the gauge holds steady and you know the system is sealed. The numbers match. You can proceed. I called the county assessor's office from the library phone. Past due property taxes on Vivian's house. $21,000. The clerk said it without emotion. The way clerks deliver numbers they have delivered many times before. I thanked her and set down the receiver. $52 against $21,000 of back taxes. A house I had not spent more than a few days at a time in many years. By any reasonable measurement, Karen had been correct. It was a liability, not an asset. I went back to Karen's house and started packing. 1 suitcase. After 42 years of accumulation, 1 suitcase. You approach it the way you approach any practical problem. Establish your constraints first, then work within them. The constraint was Margaret's weekend bag, medium-sized, the one she used for overnight trips to see her sister in Indianapolis. The contents were chosen for function. 6 days of clothing, a weatherproof jacket, work boots, my notebook and 2 pens, a cell phone with a cracked screen that still worked, the pocket watch in the outer pocket. Margaret's wedding ring was in the front pocket of my shirt, near enough that I could feel it against my chest when I breathed. My own ring, I kept on my hand. I was not ready to change that. Karen said I could come back for the rest later. I looked around the bedroom. The books. The plumbing manuals. The wall of photographs. My toolbox in the garage, 35 years of wrenches and cutters and fittings organized in a system only I understood. I looked at all of it, and I understood that I probably would not come back. Not because of any prohibition, but because some things belong to a version of your life that no longer exists, and carrying them into the next one does not bring that version back. It just adds weight to pipes that are already under pressure. I left most of it. The morning I left, I told Karen at the kitchen counter, quietly, the way you announce a decision that is already made. She looked at me. I have tried to read that look many times since, and I still cannot place it exactly. It was not guilt. It was not quite relief. Something closer to the expression of someone watching a situation develop in a direction they did not expect, but cannot directly object to. All right, Dad. I picked up the suitcase and walked out. The Greyhound station was 11 blocks from Karen's house. I walked it. The suitcase had wheels, but the sidewalks were uneven in places, and I mostly carried it. It was not heavy. That surprised me, that a life could pack down to something you could carry 11 blocks without stopping to rest. On the bus, I took the window seat. The Ohio flatlands stretched and then thinned as we drove southeast. And then the land began folding itself into hills. And then the hills became something more serious. Blue ridge lines appearing and disappearing in the late winter haze. I had grown up visiting that terrain every summer and Christmas. I had left it behind when I started my apprenticeship at 20, and come back less and less over the decades. Watching it rise up outside the window now felt like something I did not have an exact name for. Not homecoming. Not yet. Something before that. Something closer to recognition. The pocket watch was in my jacket. I took it out once, somewhere in the middle of West Virginia, and held it flat on my palm. The weight of it. The smoothness. I turned it over and looked at the 6 numbers on the back, engraved by hand in Vivian's careful script. I still did not know what they meant. I put it back. I pressed my shoulder against the cold glass and watched Virginia come in from the dark. The bus let me off at a gas station on the edge of Briar Hollow at 5:15. The sun was already behind the ridge, and the air carried the smell of wet earth and wood smoke. The particular combination that belongs to mountain towns in early spring when the cold is breaking, but has not fully decided to leave. I went inside and asked the attendant, a young man with a high school jacket and a crossword puzzle folded on the counter, if he could point me toward Vivian Hadley's place, on Chestnut Ridge Road. He looked up from his puzzle. You family. Her son. A pause. Not uncomfortable. The kind that comes when someone is recalibrating what they expected. Nobody has been out there since the burial, he said. I know. He gave me the directions. Chestnut Ridge Road, head east. About 3.5 miles. Maybe a little more. No turns. Red mailbox with a broken flag on the hinge. I thanked him and walked back to the road. 3.5 miles is not a long distance for a man who has always walked. I had never owned a gym membership in my life, but 35 years of crawling under houses and walking job sites, and pacing the long corridors of hospital buildings over the past 2 years, had kept my body familiar with distance. The suitcase had wheels. The road was not entirely flat. What made it different was not the distance. It was the light, which was dropping faster than I had accounted for, and the absence of a sidewalk, and the way the road curved ahead of me into a dark that the bare tree line did nothing to soften. I thought about Vivian as I walked. She had lived on this road for more than 55 years. Every year I came to visit. Christmas usually. Sometimes a week in summer, when Karen was young. I had driven this same route and thought vaguely that this was simply where my mother existed between my visits. That her life here was a quiet holding pattern. Until I arrived. I understood now, somewhere on that empty road with a suitcase and the last of the daylight, how limited that assumption had been. She had a whole life on this road. I just was not in most of it. A truck slowed as it passed me going the opposite direction. The driver, an older man with the window down despite the cold, looked at me. Need a lift? I am almost there. He drove on. I watched the taillights shrink for about 4 seconds, considered calling after him, and then kept walking. The mailbox appeared 10 minutes later. Red flag, broken hinge, exactly as described. The driveway beyond it was 40 yards of gravel, mostly reclaimed by grass, and the house at the end of it stopped me in place. Worse than I remembered. Much worse. At the burial 8 months earlier, I had registered the house as needing work. Paint fading. Gutters questionable. What I was looking at now was something different in kind. This was not 8 months of neglect. The siding had been losing paint for years, down to bare gray wood in long stripped sections along the south face. The left side of the front porch had dropped several inches at the corner, the platform tilting at an angle that would eventually take the railing with it. One window on the upper floor had no glass, just a dark square open to whatever weather came through. I stood at the end of the driveway for a full minute. A plumber looks at a house and reads the pipes the way other people read a face. You learn to see what is behind the surface. I read this one. The roofline was still level. The foundation had not shifted visibly from the front. The problems were surface and maintenance. Significant, but not structural. The bones were there. I went inside. The air was stale and layered. Old wood. Settled dust. And underneath both, something faint I could not immediately place. Something that might have been machine oil a long time ago. Watch oil, I realized later. The particular lubricant Vivian used in her repair work absorbed into the walls of a house where she had practiced her trade for more than half a century. I used my phone as a flashlight and moved through each room slowly. The kitchen. Vivian's blue and white dishes still stacked behind the cabinet glass. The same set that had been there my entire life. The table where she had fed me breakfast every morning of every childhood visit. Her coat hooks by the back door. Empty. Now, beyond the kitchen, through a door I had walked through 100 times as a boy, was the workshop. Vivian's watchmaking shop. The room where she had spent most of her working hours for 55 years. The workbench was still there, a magnifying lamp clamped to its edge. Tweezers in a leather roll. Small glass jars of watch parts arranged on a rack against the wall. A row of tools I could not name, each one hanging on its own hook in a system that had not been disturbed. The workshop had a basement. A steep staircase, older construction, each tread narrow. I went down because the habit is automatic after 35 years. When I arrive at any structure I have not inspected before, I go to the foundation. It tells you more about a building's real condition than anything above it. The basement floor was full plank wood, typical for Blue Ridge construction from the 1930s. And it was dry. The first genuinely good sign I had encountered since the driveway. I swept the flashlight across the floor. My eye caught it almost immediately. The way a plumber's eye catches a fitting that does not match the rest of the line. In the northeast corner, a section of 4 or 5 boards that did not belong with the rest, slightly lighter in color, grain running at a marginally different angle. And when I crouched and looked closely, no nail heads. Not one. Every other board in that basement was fastened with cut nails, visible and consistent under the light. This section had none. No nail holes. No countersunk heads. No evidence of permanent fastening. I pressed my knuckles against the wood. The sound that came back was hollow, deeper and more resonant than the solid thud the rest of the floor produced. Like knocking on a door that opened onto a larger room. Someone built this to be removed. I noted it and went back upstairs. The first morning in Briar Hollow, I woke before dawn on a bare mattress in Vivian's room with a quilt from the hall closet pulled over me. I lay still and took a methodical inventory of everything I had. It did not take long. 1 suitcase. $30 in cash. A phone at 40% battery, with no working charger. Margaret's ring in my shirt pocket. The pocket watch in my jacket. A house with no electricity, no running water, and a section of workshop floor I had not yet resolved. I got up and went to work. The first 5 days established a routine. Mornings I swept and cleared, carrying armfuls of mildewed bedding out to the back fence to air in what sun came through the trees. Afternoons I worked the interior, the bathroom walls, the kitchen shelving, The gutters I could reach from the porch roof without a proper ladder. I scrubbed mold from the bathroom tile with a brush from under the kitchen sink and a container of powdered cleaner that had just enough useful life left in it. I found a broken window latch in the spare bedroom and wedged it shut with folded cardboard from a cereal box in the pantry. Not permanent. But the draft that had been moving through the upper floor at night went quiet after that. In plumbing, you learn early that a temporary fix applied correctly buys you the time to do the permanent work later. The cardboard was a temporary fix. It held. On the second day, I walked into town and back. 7 miles total. I spent $18 on food. Dried beans, rice, canned tomatoes, coffee, a box of oatmeal, $4 on emergency candles. That left $8 in my wallet, and a clear working knowledge of how carefully I would need to manage it. Vivian was everywhere I looked. Her handwriting on the labels of mason jars in the pantry closet, preserves dated in her precise slanted script. Her reading glasses folded in the kitchen drawer, beside a stub of pencil and 3 rubber bands. A grocery list written on the back of an old envelope. Milk, white vinegar, stamps, bird seed, a copy of a cookbook with margin notes, adjustments, substitutions, a star beside the cornbread recipe, with the word double underlined twice. I opened it, and a small pressed flower fell out from between the pages, dried flat and nearly transparent. I did not know what kind it was. I put it back exactly where it had been. There was a half-finished letter on the back of a church bulletin. 2 lines in her hand, and then nothing, as if she had set it down mid-thought and meant to return to it. I did not know what she had meant to say. I put it back. The handwriting of someone who is gone carries a presence that photographs do not always manage. I recognized her script from birthday cards she had sent when I was in trade school 40 years ago. It looked exactly the same. Careful, unhurried. Every letter formed completely. I sat with those papers longer than I had planned. In the workshop, her tools hung in their places on the wall. The magnifying lamp still clamped to the bench. The small glass jars of watch parts still arranged on their rack. I stood in the doorway and looked at that room the way you look at a workspace that belongs to someone who understood their trade at a level you did not fully appreciate while they were alive. My mother had repaired watches in this room for 55 years. I had known that the way you know facts about your parents that do not carry weight until later. She fixed watches. She tended a garden. She drove the same car for 25 years. She said less than she knew. I was beginning to understand that last part differently now. On the 6th morning, I walked to the mailbox. The envelope was inside. No stamp. No return address. No postage mark. Someone had placed it by hand. Inside, $400 in cash. A mix of 20s and 10s. And a small, folded note. The handwriting was unsteady, but clear. The script of older hands that still knew exactly what they were doing. Vivian was a good woman. Welcome home. I stood at the end of the driveway for a while. In a town this size, people are aware. They knew Vivian was gone. They knew someone had arrived at the house. They had not introduced themselves, which I understood. Grief and privacy run together in small places. But they had not done nothing, either. I found myself more affected than I expected. Not primarily by the money, though that mattered considerably. By the simpler fact of being seen. For several weeks, I had been operating as though I had become invisible. This envelope said otherwise. I did not try to find who had left it. I divided the money carefully. Half toward utilities. Half held back. The nearest neighbor lived half a mile down the county road. An older woman. She answered her door carefully, measured and friendly in the way of people who live on quiet roads. I explained who I was. She let me use her landline without hesitation. The utility office confirmed reconnection for both electricity and water. A deposit plus service fees, $180 total. I scheduled it for the following morning. By late afternoon, the crew had been and gone. I threw the main breaker. The kitchen light came on. I stood there looking at it for a moment that was longer than the situation required. Then, I ran the tap. The water came out brown from standing pipes and ran that way for several minutes before it cleared. I held my hand under it until it was cold and clean. A plumber knows what clean water means. It means the system is flowing. It means the house is coming back. That evening I cooked on Vivian's gas burner. Beans, rice, canned tomatoes. I ate at her kitchen table, looking out toward the backyard, where the old elm tree was visible in the fading light, its branches wide and dark against the sky. I rinsed my bowl in the sink and watched the water run clear. The house had electricity, water, and something in the workshop basement that did not behave like the rest of it. That Saturday I walked into town for the weekly farmers market. I had heard about it from the utility crew. Two men who had mentioned it while reconnecting the main line. The way people in small towns mention things they assume you already know about. The market occupied a gravel lot behind the post office. Canvas tents and folding tables arranged in 2 rows with a narrow lane between them. Vegetables from early spring gardens. Jars of sourwood honey. Smoked sausage wrapped in brown paper. A woman selling quilts from the back of a station wagon. The smell of wood smoke and frying onions drifting from a food stand at the far end. I bought coffee and a small bag of dried apples and moved through the crowd slowly. The crowd was not large, perhaps 40 people, but it carried the particular energy of a community that gathers regularly and knows itself well. People called to each other across the lane. Children ran between the tables. An older man near the entrance was tuning a banjo without any apparent intention of playing it. At the far end of the second row, past the produce tables and the baked goods, there was a stall that did not match the rest. A heavy wooden table with a canvas awning. No vegetables. No jars. Instead, an arrangement of hand-forged tools laid out on dark cloth. Kitchen knives with wooden handles. Garden implements. A set of iron hooks. Each piece had the particular weight and finish that comes from being shaped by hand rather than stamped by machine. The man behind the table was perhaps 72, built in the way that comes from decades of physical labor that shapes the body rather than wears it down, wide through the shoulders, carrying useful weight, gray hair cut close, hands that were thick and rough in the specific way of someone who has worked hot metal for a very long time. He was sharpening a blade on a whetstone with the automatic ease of a motion repeated 10,000 times. He looked up when I stopped at his table. His hand paused on the stone. He examined me with the brief, practiced attention of a man who has spent a working life reading materials, what they are made of, what they will handle, whether the person holding them knows the difference. Vivian Hadley's burial, he said. 8 months ago. You were standing across from me, in a gray coat. He did not frame it as a question. It was a statement he was confirming for himself. I apprenticed under a smith in Roanoke named Carver, who repaired clock casings for your mother for close to 30 years. Silver cases, brass housings, anything that needed metalwork beyond what her tools could manage. When she passed, I felt I should be there. I did not introduce myself. It did not seem like the right time. His name was Gus Pemberton. We stood on either side of his table, and a brief silence held between us. 2 older men, in a small-town market with 8 months and 1 woman between them. A woman they had each known in entirely different ways, in different parts of her life, and who had apparently connected them without either of them knowing it. Gus asked where I was staying. Vivian's house. How long was I here? However long it takes. He accepted that answer without comment, the way someone does when they recognize it and do not need it, explained further. His eyes moved to my hands. A tradesman reads hands the way other people read faces. Mine told him I had worked with tools for a living. His told me the same. What are you working on out there? I told him about the workshop basement floor. The northeast corner. The section of boards that did not match the rest. Different wood. No nails. The hollow resonance when I knocked. Gus listened straight through without interrupting. His expression shifted while I spoke. the particular change I have seen in experienced people when something aligns with knowledge they already carry. 25 years in metalwork and forge construction, he said when I had finished. False floors, concealed storage, hidden chambers. Those are not unusual in older Blue Ridge buildings, especially from the 40s and 50s. People in these mountains had their reasons for keeping things private, and they had the skill to do it properly. He paused and looked at the knife on the stone. Old construction in this region follows patterns. You learn to read what was meant to be found and what was not. The two are not always obvious from the surface. A pry bar will get the boards up, but you want someone who can read what is underneath before you commit to anything. If there is nothing there, you will have confirmed it and moved on. He said it plainly. No drama, no speculation. I will come by Monday morning. I am not occupied with anything pressing. I thanked him. We talked for a few more minutes about the house, about the road, about the weather turning. Then I bought one of his kitchen knives, a mid-sized blade with an ash handle, because it was well made, and because I needed one, and because there are transactions between tradesmen that carry more weight than the price on the tag. I walked home carrying the knife and the dried apples and thinking about what had just happened. A man I had never spoken to had offered to drive out to a county road and spend his Monday morning helping a stranger open a basement floor on the basis that he had once repaired clock casings for my mother through a smith in Roanoke. He had asked nothing about payment. He had asked nothing about what I expected to find. He had offered the way people offer things when they have already decided and do not need a longer discussion about it. I had a daughter who had spent 18 months preparing legal documents to take everything I had built. Paperwork and planning and professional precision. I had a stranger I had met 30 minutes ago who had offered his Monday with no terms whatsoever. I sat with that arithmetic on the walk home and did not say anything about it to anyone because there was nothing useful to say. The math was simple enough. Simple things sometimes take a while to absorb fully. Inside, I set the pry bar at the top of the workshop stairs, placed for morning the way you stage a tool before work begins. Then I looked at the pocket watch on Vivian's dresser. 6 numbers I had not decoded. A section of floor that did not belong with the rest. And a blacksmith arriving Monday morning, with 25 years of experience reading what metal and wood were hiding. Wind it when you're ready. I was beginning to think I might be ready. Gus Pemberton arrived at 6:35 on Monday morning. I noted the time because I had been awake since 4 and had been watching the end of the driveway since 6. He came with a vacuum thermos of coffee and 2 cups, which told me he had thought this through more carefully than a casual offer required. We stood on the porch and drank without much conversation. The morning was cold enough that the steam rose straight up from both cups before the air caught it. 2 cups of coffee on a porch. I had started every morning of my marriage with 2 cups of tea at a kitchen table. The parallel was not lost on me. Gus looked at the elm tree in the backyard. It was large even from this distance. The kind of tree that had outlasted several generations of the people who had lived near it. That is old growth, he said. Must be 150 years at least. My mother tended it every summer when I was a boy. We used to sit under it, and she would tell me the names of the birds. He nodded once slowly and did not say anything further. We finished the coffee. I took both cups inside, rinsed them, and set them on the counter beside Vivian's blue and white dishes. When I came back out, Gus was already at the door waiting. We went down. The workshop staircase was steep in the way of older construction, each tread narrow. Gus went first, testing each step before committing his weight. His flashlight was a serious piece of equipment, the kind used in professional inspection work. When he switched it on at the bottom of the stairs, it changed the room entirely. Every corner came in clearly. The rough texture of the foundation walls, the underside of the floor joists overhead, the full dimensions of the space, all of it visible in a way my phone flashlight had never managed. Gus moved through the basement without speaking. He made a complete circuit of the room before he stopped anywhere. The way someone does when they are building a picture of a space, rather than reacting to the first detail that catches their eye. I watched him look and I looked where he looked, which is the most useful thing you can do when you are working with someone who knows more than you about a particular subject. When he reached the northeast corner, he set the flashlight on the floor and crouched over the section of boards I had marked in my memory days earlier. He ran his hand across them methodically, not tapping yet, just feeling the surface, the seams, the edge where this section met the surrounding floor. "Different wood," he said. "Did you catch the color difference in daylight?" "And no nails," I said. "Not a single head anywhere in that section." "That is intentional." He kept his eyes on the floor. "Someone cut these boards to fit this exact space without mechanical fastening. Friction fit. Each board held in place by the tension of the surrounding structure rather than hardware. It is not a technique you use by accident. That is skilled carpentry done for a specific purpose." He pressed his knuckle down and knocked twice. The sound came back hollow, deeper, and more resonant than the solid return every other part of the floor produced, like knocking on a lid that covered something larger underneath. "I have heard that before," Gus said. He straightened up slowly, using his knee in the way of men who have spent decades on surfaces harder than this one. "In old forge work, hidden storage chambers beneath a work floor. You set a false panel in, and from above it looks like any other section. The space below stays invisible until someone who knows what to look for comes along." He looked at the boards again. "Your mother put this here, or had it put here, by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. She moved into this house in 1958, I said. Gus absorbed that. "Then she planned for this from early on. This was not an afterthought. We used the pry bar together. Gus directed the placement. The correct edge of the first board. The angle of entry. The amount of controlled pressure. The boards had been designed to be removed. That was the point of them. With the right approach, they lifted without resistance, one after another. The wood moving cleanly on a fit that had been maintained by the closed space below and the weight of decades not walking on it. First board, second, third. Each one set aside to the right, kept in order. Beneath the last board, a flat, smooth surface. Not wood, not concrete. Steel, dark gray. Cool under the flashlight. I crouched and looked at it properly. A steel hatch set into a steel frame that had been welded directly into the surrounding concrete of the foundation. Not set on top of it. Built into it. The frame was thick, the welds visible at the corners. Deep enough that they had clearly been done by someone who understood structural metalwork. This was not improvised construction. Someone with professional equipment and professional knowledge had fabricated this and installed it when the foundation was accessible, which meant it had been here for a very long time. On the hatch, a combination lock. 3 rotating dials. 2 digits on each dial. 6 digits total. Gus stepped back without being asked. He moved to the foot of the stairs and stood there with his flashlight pointed at the floor, giving me the space in the corner. I had not said anything to him about the pocket watch. I had not said anything about the 6 numbers. I pulled the watch from my jacket and stood over the hatch and looked at it. 8 months I had carried it. Through Vivian's death. Through Margaret's illness. And the last weeks in Ohio. Through a Greyhound ride into the mountains. I had assumed the numbers were a date. An anniversary. Something sentimental I would understand eventually if I thought about it long enough. Standing above a steel hatch 12 feet from where Vivian had repaired watches for 55 years, I understood exactly what they were. I held the watch in my left hand and reached for the first dial with my right. I turned it the way I used to calibrate pressure gauges. Slowly. With full attention. Because precision is not something you approximate. The second number. The third. Each dial finding its position with a soft mechanical click that was the only sound in the basement apart from the hum of the water pressure system running through the wall above us. The fourth. The fifth. Gus had not moved from his position at the foot of the stairs. His flashlight was aimed at the floor between us, giving me light without pointing it at my hands. The kind of consideration that comes from working alongside people in close quarters for decades and knowing when to assist and when to simply hold steady. I held the sixth number in place with my thumb. One breath. Then, I set it. The lock released with a single clean click. Not loud, not dramatic. Just the precise sound of a mechanism doing exactly what it was designed to do after waiting a very long time for someone to ask it correctly. I lifted the handle. The hatch was heavier than I expected, but it moved without resistance, swinging up and back on hinges that operated with a smoothness that had nothing to do with age. I stopped and examined the hinges directly. No surface rust, no stiffness at the pivot. These had been lubricated. Not once, when the hatch was installed, but maintained regularly over time. Something that had not been opened in 50 years would not move like this. The hatch had been accessed recently. That was the first thing I understood. The air that rose from the opening was cool and dry. A breath of it reached my face before the temperature equalized. No mildew. No staleness. No smell of a sealed space. What I caught instead was something cleaner. Old metal. Old paper. And underneath both, something faintly like cedar. The smell of preservation done correctly over a long period of time. Gus offered to go first. I looked at him across the open hatch. This was my mother's. Whatever she left here, she left for me. He stepped back without another word. I found the steel ladder mounted to the inner wall of the shaft. 10 rungs. Each one solid under my hands and boots. I counted them as I went down the way you count anything. When you want to keep your mind attached to what is real and measurable, rather than what you are feeling. At the bottom, my boots met a poured concrete floor that had been kept swept. 12 feet below the workshop, 12 feet below the house my mother had lived in for 55 years, working in the room directly overhead every day of that time. Knowing this was here, I turned on the flashlight and swept it across the space. I stopped breathing for a moment. That was probably several seconds. The room was the full footprint of the workshop basement above it, larger than I had been prepared for. The walls were reinforced concrete block, the mortar lines clean and tight. The construction had nothing amateur about it. Whoever had built this had known exactly what they were doing and had been given the time and resources to do it correctly. On the far wall, 2 pieces of equipment. One was a compact climate control unit, older in design. I recognized the style from late 80s or early 90s manufacture, mounted to the wall with a dedicated electrical line running to a panel I had not noticed in the basement above. Beside it, a small industrial dehumidifier, more recent, positioned to cycle air across the lower portion of the room. Both were running. The soft operational sound of both machines was what I had been hearing from the bottom of the ladder without identifying it. Someone had maintained these units over time. Replaced the dehumidifier at some point with a newer model. Kept the climate unit serviced. This room had not been abandoned. It had been managed. The rest of the room stopped me a second time. Shelving, floor to ceiling on 3 walls. Built from what looked like cherry wood. Solid, well-joined. Constructed with the same seriousness as everything else in this space. Hundreds of individual sections, each one holding objects of a specific kind. Glass-top display cases, each sealed and sitting in its own fitted position. Flat acetate envelopes, sealed and labeled. Every single item tagged in the same hand. Vivian's handwriting. The same precise slanted script I had found on mason jar labels in the pantry upstairs, now applied to an inventory that covered 3 walls and stretched from my ankle to above my head. I moved to the nearest shelf and lifted one of the display cases. Inside, seated in a form-fitted velvet insert, a pocket watch. Small, silver case with the green-gold patina that comes from age rather than neglect. The face was ivory, the numerals hand-painted, the movement visible through a clear caseback. Vivian's label read, 1794. Thomas Earnshaw Marine Chronometer. Silver case. Original movement. Exceptional condition. I set it back. I took down one of the acetate envelopes. Inside, a certificate of authenticity from a London Horological Society, dated 1963. Beside it, a provenance card in Vivian's hand, tracing the watch's ownership from its original commission through 4 subsequent holders to the point where it had come into her possession. Every transfer documented, every date recorded. I walked the length of the shelving slowly, reading the organization, the way you read a pipe schematic, looking for the system underneath the surface. It was there, sorted by type, then by period, then by condition grade. Each label carried a date of acquisition, a provenance note, and a condition assessment in consistent terminology. This was not the collection of someone with a casual interest. This was the work of a person who had studied, developed a methodology, and applied it with the same discipline across decades. The most recent labels carried dates from 3 and 4 years ago. Vivian had been coming down here until close to the end of her life, adding items, updating the catalog, maintaining what she had built. At the far end of the room, a work table. The surface clean. A magnifying loupe on a stand. A specialized lamp positioned for close examination. Cotton handling gloves folded in a neat stack. The tools of someone who knew how to handle what was on those shelves without damaging it. And in the center of the table, placed with the kind of deliberateness that makes it clear something was meant to be found, a thick envelope. My name written in blue ink on the front. Vivian's hand. In the lower right corner, below my name, a date. 14 months ago. My mother had written this letter 14 months before she died. And she had known exactly what was coming. Before I read you what my mother wrote in that letter, 7 pages, written 14 months before she died by a woman who knew exactly what was coming, drop the number 7 in the comments right now. 7 pages. Just let me know you are still here, because what she wrote changed everything I thought I knew about the woman who raised me, and I do not want you to miss a single word of it. A quick note before we continue. Parts of this story include fictional elements, built to explore real situations that happen in real families. If that is not what you came here for, this is a good place to step away. No hard feelings. But if you are still with me, this is where it gets real. Gus had climbed back up through the hatch without being asked. That was the right thing to do, and the kind of judgment that comes from reading a situation rather than waiting to be told. I heard his boots on the steel rungs, heard the hatch settle above me, and then there was only the low mechanical hum of the climate unit and the sound of my own breathing. I sat down at the work table, set the pages flat in front of me. 7 of them, written in the same blue ink my mother had used for as long as I could remember. She ordered those pens by the dozen from a catalog that probably did not exist anymore. The date on the first page confirmed what I had already understood from the equipment running on the wall. She had been here recently. She had known what was coming, and she had prepared for it. I began, Harry, if you are reading this, I am gone. And I owe you the truth about something I carried quietly for most of my adult life. The first thing I thought was that she had always written the way she spoke. Directly. Without decorative opening. The second thing I thought was that I had not heard her voice in 14 months, and I was now hearing it clearly through ink on paper in a concrete room 12 feet below her workshop. I want to begin with something important. I maintained access to this room. The floor above was designed to be opened and replaced. I could come down here whenever I needed to. The last time I was in this room was approximately 8 months before I wrote this letter. I maintained it because what is here requires maintenance. I will explain more shortly. I set page 1 aside and continued. The second page was where she started with the Hadley family. My grandparents on her side. People I had known only from photographs and the stories she told during summer visits when I was a boy. My parents held things from a different era. Timepieces from before the Civil War. Before standardized manufacturing existed in this country. Pocket watches made by hand. One at a time. By craftsmen whose names are now in museum catalogs. When they died, those things came to me. She wrote about time the way only a watchmaker could. Not as a resource to be managed, but as a force that acted on objects and changed their meaning. Do you understand what 160 years does to value? Scarcity premium compounds the way interest compounds, except the rate is driven by history, not markets. Every decade that passes without another specimen appearing makes what already exists worth more. A hand-built chronometer in original condition was rare in 1910. It was rarer in 1950. By the time you are reading this, the number of people who will ever hold one is fixed and small and shrinking. I stopped and looked at the shelves, the labels, the system. 55 years of careful work in a room no one else knew existed. She had inherited seeds and grown a forest. Quietly, one careful season at a time. The third page covered the workshop. 38 years of repairing watches in Briar Hollow gave me something worth considerably more than a salary: expertise and access. People in this community brought me timepieces to repair that they did not understand and did not value. Family heirlooms kept in drawers, estate pieces sold for the cost of the repair. I processed those transactions. I always knew when something carried value far beyond what the owner believed. She anticipated the question I would have asked if she had been sitting across from me. Every acquisition I made was properly documented. I never took anything that was not offered to me. And I never paid less than what the person offering it understood it to be worth. The advantage was knowledge, not deception. Knowledge is a form of advantage. I used mine honestly. I thought about that sentence for a long time. A woman who could have exploited every person who walked through her workshop door, and who instead had built her collection on the principle that fair payment and superior understanding were not contradictions. She had been more honest than she needed to be. Deliberately. As a discipline. Page 4 explained why she had kept the room accessible. I never sealed this space permanently. The floor above was designed to look fixed while functioning as a panel, convincing to anyone who did not know what they were looking at, which was everyone. I came down here approximately twice a year for most of my adult life, to add items, to check preservation conditions, to update the catalog, and in the last several years, to write this letter through a number of drafts. She paused in the writing here. I could tell from a slight change in the spacing between lines, as though she had set the pen down and picked it up again. The version you are holding is the fourth. The previous 3 are in the furnace. I wanted precision more than I wanted speed. 4 drafts. Written to a son she expected would find them only after she was gone. She had taken the same care with this letter that she had taken with everything else in this room. Nothing approximate. Nothing rushed. I lowered the pages and looked at the room around me. A woman I had called every Sunday afternoon. A woman I had visited at Christmas. Sometimes for a week in summer, when Karen was young. A woman I had thought of without much examination as content with a quiet life. A garden, her watches, the small routines of a small town. I had driven past this house every visit for 40 years and gone back to Ohio thinking I understood what her life looked like. I had understood almost none of it. I turned to page 5. The handwriting had not changed. Still that careful, even script she had maintained her entire life. But in the left margin, 3 small pencil marks pressed lightly into the paper. She used to make marks like that in cookbook margins when a recipe mattered. Stars. Underlines. Small notations that said, "This one." I revised until it was right. She had practiced this part. The pocket watch. The mechanism is simple, but it required a skilled hand to install correctly. I asked a jeweler in Richmond to build a concealed compartment into the back casing, accessible only when the mainspring is wound to full tension. The winding action releases an internal latch. The back panel opens. I reached into my jacket and took out the watch. I looked at it in the light of the workshop lamp. 8 months I had carried it. Through Vivian's death, through Margaret's illness, through Ohio and a Greyhound bus and 3.5 miles of gravel road in the dark, I had never wound it. I had never thought to test whether the casing held anything beyond its face. As a plumber, You will understand the mechanism faster than most people would. A pressure release valve. Force applied in one direction opens a passage in another. The principle is the same whether you are working with water or with brass. She was right. I did understand it. And I understood why I had missed it. I had been carrying the watch the way you carry a keepsake. I had not been carrying it the way you carry a tool. The letter continued. This letter gives you the distance. 22 steps from the workshop back door. Following the line of the elm tree. 12 inches down. You will need something to dig with. I have left a hand trowel in the potting shed along the east wall. Both pieces of information are necessary. The watch alone will not put you in the correct spot. The steps alone are useless without the direction. I wanted you to need both. Page 6 was the trust. This property and everything on it is held in an irrevocable living trust, established in 1976 and registered under Vivian Rose Hadley. My birth name. Not my married name. I chose my birth name deliberately because I wanted this to be findable only by someone who was directed to find it. She explained the mechanics. The county recorder's office held only paper records from that period. Never digitized. A search by property address or parcel number would show the property existed, but the trust document itself required a physical visit to the courthouse to locate. Anyone who searched online, or who searched under the name Bennett, would find nothing. The lawyer in Briar Hollow has held the original trust documents for 40 years. His name and address are in the envelope with this letter. He is expecting you. I thought about Karen. About the family meeting. About her checking her notes and telling me the house was essentially worthless. She was a certified public accountant. She would have searched. She would have searched online, under Vivian's married name, and concluded within minutes that there was nothing here. The assumption of a person who trusted their first look, the assumption I had spent 35 years teaching apprentices never to make. Check the joint twice. Always check the joint twice. The bottom of page 6 held the paragraph that rearranged everything. I called Karen 14 months ago. I told her about the trust. I told her the property was more significant than its appearance. I asked her to make sure you were told. She said she understood. She said she would make sure you knew. I set the page down on the table very carefully. The way you set down something that has just become heavier than it was a moment before. Page 7 was brief. More white space at the bottom than the previous pages. As though she had decided to stop, rather than fill it. I knew Margaret was sick. I knew what you were giving her in those last months. Your full presence. Your complete attention. That is the most valuable thing a person can give another person. And there is no version of it that is wrong or wasted. Do not carry guilt for it. I understood. I always understood. A space. Then the last line. The time you gave Margaret did not take anything from me. It told me everything I needed to know about who you are. With all the love I had, and never said enough. Mom. I folded the letter along its original creases and held it in both hands for a while. Then I climbed the ladder. Gus was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he had made himself. He looked at me. He did not ask anything. I took the trowel from the potting shed. East wall. Hanging on a nail exactly where she said it would be. I walked out the workshop back door and counted. 1, 2. The garden beds on either side, overgrown since Vivian had not been here to tend them. 10. 11. The grass longer now. 15. 16. 22. The base of the elm was at chest height in front of me. I put the trowel in at a low angle. 6 inches. 8. 10. At 12. The blade struck metal. A small tin box painted dark green. A piece of electrical tape along one edge, securing a key I only found when I turned the box over. She had put it where someone in a hurry would miss it, and someone paying attention would find it. Inside, nested in black velvet, a pocket watch, hand struck, slightly uneven at the edges, the way handwork always is. heavier than its size. Vivian's label on a card beneath it. 1786. Thomas Mudge. Pocket chronometer prototype. One of 3 known specimens. Beneath the watch, a photograph. Black and white. Slightly faded at the corners. Vivian in what looked like the 1950s. Younger than I had ever known her. Laughing in a way I recognized from 1 or 2 other photographs. A real laugh. Her hand resting on the shoulder of a boy of about 7. Both squinting into the sun. The elm tree behind them, smaller than, thinner, but the same tree. On the back, in blue ink. For you, Harry. The last piece. Mom. I sat down against the base of the elm, my back against the bark. One hand holding the photograph, and the other holding the watch. The afternoon light came through the canopy at a low angle. The kind of light that belongs to April in the Blue Ridge when the leaves are just coming in and the sun still reaches the ground. For the first time since the morning I found Margaret at the kitchen table, I cried. Not from pain, from understanding. Finally, and completely. What she had done, and why she had done it, and how long she had been doing it in silence. I sat beneath that elm tree for a long time. The tin box rested on my lap, open, with the 1786 Thomas Mudge chronometer still cradled in its velvet lining. The photograph of my mother and the boy leaned against the inside of the lid, catching the late afternoon light. I did not move until the shadows of the ridge crossed the driveway, and the air turned cool enough to raise the hair on my forearms. Gus found me there. He did not ask what was in the box. He looked at my face, looked at the open lid, and sat down on the ground beside me without a word. We stayed like that for maybe 10 minutes. Then he said, "You need someone who knows what all of this is worth." I nodded. "There is a man in Roanoke," Gus said. "Name is Alistair Crowe. Independent horological appraiser. Certified by the American Society of Appraisers and the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors. Vivian used him twice that I know of. He drove out here both times. He does not work for auction houses. He does not take a commission. He charges a flat fee and gives you a written report you can take to court, to insurance, or to the IRS. I asked how Gus knew all of that. Because I drove your mother to his office once, about 6 years ago. She had a single watch in a leather pouch. She came out 2 hours later and did not say what the number was, but she bought me a steak dinner on the way home. And your mother never bought anyone a steak dinner. I almost smiled. It was the first time in a long time that something close to humor had entered my chest without immediately being swallowed by the weight behind it. The next morning I called Alistair Crowe from the kitchen phone. The line rang 4 times. A woman answered, gave the name of the firm, and asked the nature of my inquiry. I told her I had inherited a collection of antique timepieces and needed a formal appraisal. She asked the approximate number of items. I said I was not sure, but estimated several hundred. There was a pause. She put me on hold for 40 seconds. When she returned, she said Mr. Crowe could come to the property on Thursday of the following week. The fee for an on-site preliminary survey would be $2,200, payable upon completion. A full written appraisal, if warranted, would be quoted separately. I did not have $2,200. I had the remains of the anonymous envelope minus what I had spent on groceries and the utility deposit. I told her I would call back. That evening, Gus came by with a paper bag of cornbread his wife had baked. I told him about the fee. He set the bag on the counter and said, "I will lend you the money. No interest, no paperwork. You pay me back when you can." I told him I could not accept that. "Harold," he said, "your mother fixed my grandfather's watch for free in 1971. She said the same thing to him when he tried to pay. He told her that in these mountains, people do not keep a ledger between neighbors. They keep a promise. I am keeping his promise. Take the money." I took the money. Thursday arrived under a pale sky with a thin line of clouds along the western ridge. Alistair Crowe drove up the gravel driveway at 9:14 in the morning in a dark blue sedan with Virginia plates. He was a lean man, maybe 60, with wire-rimmed glasses and a leather briefcase that looked older than most of the watches in the vault. He shook my hand at the front door, declined coffee, and asked to see the collection. I led him through the kitchen, down the basement stairs, and opened the hatch. He paused at the top of the ladder and looked at the steel frame. The climate control unit. The cedar-scented air rising from below. He adjusted his glasses and said, "This is not what I expected." He descended carefully. I followed. For the next 4 hours, Alistair Crowe moved along the cherry wood shelves with a pair of cotton gloves, a jeweler's loupe, a penlight, and a leather-bound notebook. He opened each glass-topped case, examined the movement, read Vivian's provenance cards, and wrote in a script so small I could not read it from 3 feet away. He did not speak. He did not react. He picked up a watch, studied it, set it down, and moved to the next one. His method reminded me of how I used to inspect a pressurized system. You do not guess. You do not assume. You read every gauge, check every joint, and document every reading before you form a conclusion. At 1:15 he came up the ladder, sat at the kitchen table, and accepted a glass of water. He removed his glasses, cleaned them with a cloth from his breast pocket, and put them back on. "Mr. Bennett," he said, "I have examined approximately 340 items in a preliminary capacity. I have not completed the full inventory. Based on what I have seen, the collection includes at least 14 pieces that I would classify as museum grade. The 1,794 Earnshaw Marine chronometer alone, given its condition and documentation, would likely bring between $1.8 and $2.4 million at a specialized auction. The Breguet subscription watch, if authenticated further, could exceed $3 million. He opened his briefcase and placed a single sheet of paper on the table. It was a preliminary valuation summary. At the bottom, in a box outlined in black ink, was a range, $28 million to $40 million. I read the number 3 times. I set the paper down. I picked it up and read it again. The kitchen was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of a mantel clock I had wound 2 days earlier. "This is a conservative estimate," he said. "A full catalog with authentication, provenance verification, and condition grading will take approximately 3 to 4 months. My fee for that work will be $18,000. I recommend you also engage an attorney specializing in estate and trust law, because a collection of this magnitude will attract attention from multiple parties." I thanked him. He shook my hand at the front door and drove back down the gravel road. I watched the sedan disappear past the red mailbox with the broken flag. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that. $28 to $40 million. My mother, who had lived in a house with peeling paint and a sagging porch, who had eaten oatmeal for breakfast every morning, who had worn the same 3 dresses to church for 20 years, had built a collection worth more than every house on Chestnut Ridge Road combined. And my daughter, who had taken everything I owned and handed me $52 in an envelope, had called this property a debt. I thought about calling Karen. I picked up the phone twice. Both times I set it down. There was nothing to say yet. In plumbing, you do not open a valve until the downstream system is ready to handle the flow. If you release pressure into a line that has not been tested, you get a blowout. And a blowout in this situation would cost me more than pipes. That night I called the number Alistair Crowe had written on the back of his business card. It was a law firm in Charlottesville. Whitfield, Ames, and Burke. They specialized in estate litigation, trust disputes, and high one-value asset protection. The receptionist said the earliest consultation was 2 weeks out. I gave my name, the address of the property, and a one-sentence summary of the situation. She called back in 40 minutes and said they could see me on Monday. Monday morning, I put on the only collared shirt I had brought in the suitcase. It was a pale blue cotton buttony down that Margaret had ironed for me the last time I wore it, nearly 2 months before she died. The creases were still sharp along the sleeves. I noticed that while buttoning the cuffs and had to stop for a moment and breathe. Gus drove me to Charlottesville in his 1997 Ford pickup. The truck smelled like forge smoke and pine tar. He did not ask questions on the way. He played a country station at low volume and kept both hands on the wheel. The drive took a little over 2 hours through the valley, past white-fenced horse farms and small towns with single stoplights. I watched the landscape and thought about the fact that I was riding to a law firm with a preliminary appraisal worth $28 to $40 million, folded in the breast pocket of a shirt my dead wife had ironed. The office of Whitfield, Ames & Burke occupied the second floor of a brick building on East Market Street. The receptionist led us to a conference room with tall windows and a long walnut table. Gus sat in the waiting area with a magazine he did not read. Victoria Ames entered at 10:05. She was perhaps 50, with short silver hair, no jewelry except a watch, and a handshake that was firm without being performative. She carried a yellow legal pad and a black pen. She sat across from me and said, "Mr. Bennett, tell me everything from the beginning. Do not leave anything out." I started with Margaret's diagnosis. I told her about the 20 months of treatment, the 4 documents Karen had brought over 18 months, the general power of attorney I signed 4 days after the funeral, and the family meeting where Karen told me the cabin was all that was left. I told her about the $52, the bus ride, the walk up Chestnut Ridge Road, the false floor, the pocket watch, the 6-digit code, the vault, the 340 timepieces, the 7-page letter, the 22 steps to the elm tree, the tin box, and the preliminary appraisal in my breast pocket. Victoria Ames did not interrupt once. She filled 3 pages in tight, angular script. When I finished, she set the pen down, aligned it parallel to the pad, and looked at me. "Mr. Bennett, I need to ask you direct questions, and I need honest answers." I nodded. "Did you read any of the 4 documents before you signed them?" "No." "Did Karen explain the legal effect of each document at the time of signing?" "She said they were standard estate planning. She said it would protect both of us." "Did she ever mention your mother's irrevocable living trust?" "No." "I learned about the trust from my mother's letter in the vault. Your mother's letter states she called Karen 14 months before her death and explained the trust. Is that correct?" "That is what the letter says." Victoria wrote one more line. Then she leaned back and folded her hands. "Here is what I see. Your daughter holds a general power of attorney signed under circumstances a court would likely consider compromised. You were grieving. You were under extreme emotional duress. You had no independent legal counsel. The document was presented by someone with a direct financial interest. That alone gives us grounds to petition for revocation." She paused. "But there is more. If your mother informed Karen about the irrevocable trust and Karen never disclosed that to you, that is a breach of fiduciary duty. Concealing a trust that directly benefits you is not negligent. It is potentially fraudulent." The word sat in the room like a stone dropped into still water. "What do we do?" I asked. 3 things. First, I file a petition to revoke the power of attorney on grounds of undue influence and lack of informed consent. Second, I file a motion to freeze assets held in the living trust that Karen and Troy manage, pending a full accounting. Third, I send a formal demand to Karen's attorney, requesting all financial records related to your estate, your pension, your Social Security, and every transaction made under the power of attorney. She picked up the pen again. I also recommend a forensic accountant to trace every dollar that moved through that trust account. If Karen redirected your income for personal benefit, we will find it. I asked about the collection. The irrevocable trust your mother created in 1976 is entirely separate from anything Karen controls. An irrevocable trust cannot be modified by anyone other than the original grantor, and your mother is deceased. You are the sole beneficiary. Karen has no legal claim to the collection, the property, or any asset within that trust. None. She said the last word with slight emphasis that was not theatrical. It was structural. Like a load-bearing wall you identify during demolition. You do not touch it. Bay. Everything else can come down, but that wall stays. I asked what it would cost. My retainer is $15,000. Estimated total through resolution, assuming litigation, ranges from $45,000 to $70,000. Given the assets in question, this is a sound investment. But understand something. Your daughter will fight this. She has a CPA background. She structured those documents deliberately. This was not carelessness. This was a system. A system. I understood systems. I had spent 41 years inside them. Copper, iron, PVC, galvanized steel. Every system has a design, a flow direction, and pressure points. If you understand the blueprint, you know where to apply force and where to shut off supply. Karen had built a system to move everything into her control. But she had not accounted for the one line she could not see, the one my mother had buried beneath the floor. I signed the retainer agreement. Victoria shook my hand and said her team would begin that afternoon. Gus was still in the waiting area. He stood up, put the unread magazine on the table, and said, "How did it go?" "She called it a system," I said. Gus nodded slowly. "Your mother built a better one." We drove back to Briar Hollow in silence. The mountains rose on both sides, and the afternoon light turned the ridgeline gold. I held the pocket watch in my left hand the entire way. The case was warm. The ticking was steady, and for the first time since Margaret's funeral, I felt like the pressure in the line was finally going somewhere it was supposed to go. Victoria Ames worked fast. Within 72 hours of our meeting, 3 things happened. A petition to revoke the general power of attorney was filed in the Circuit Court of Montgomery County, Ohio. A motion to freeze all assets held in the Family Living Trust was submitted to the same court. And a formal demand letter was sent by certified mail to Karen Bennett Driscoll at her home address in Charlotte, North Carolina. I know this because Victoria called me each time. She spoke in short, clear sentences, the way a foreman reads a punch list. Item filed. Item served. Item confirmed. I wrote the dates on the back of a grocery receipt and pinned it to the kitchen wall next to my mother's handwritten pantry labels. On the 4th day, Karen called me. I was standing at the kitchen sink, washing a coffee mug. The phone buzzed on the counter, and her name appeared on the screen. I dried my hands on a dish towel, picked up the phone, and answered. "Dad, what is this?" Her voice was controlled but tight. The kind of tight I recognized from years of working under houses where the pipe has not burst yet. But the fitting is already weeping, pressure building behind a joint that looks fine from the outside. "What is what, Karen?" I received a letter from an attorney in Charlottesville demanding financial records. There is a petition filed against me in Ohio, and someone is trying to freeze the trust. "What are you doing?" "I am protecting what is mine." There was a silence. 4 seconds. Maybe 5. Then she said, "You do not have anything, Dad. We went over this. The cabin is a liability. I told you that. You told me a lot of things." Another silence. Longer this time. "Dad, whoever is advising you is taking advantage of a grieving old man. You need to stop this before it costs you money you do not have." I looked out the kitchen window at the elm tree. The lady morning light was coming through the branches and casting a pattern on the ground that looked like the hands of a clock. I thought about my mother's letter, page 6, the paragraph where she wrote that she had called Karen 14 months before her death and explained the irrevocable trust. That Karen had understood. That Karen had promised to tell me. "Karen," I said, "did your grandmother ever call you about a trust?" The silence that followed was different from the others. It was not strategic. It was not controlled. It was the silence of someone who has just heard a sound inside a wall that should not be there. The silence before you decide whether to open the panel or walk away. "I do not know what you are talking about," she said. "Then you have nothing to worry about," I said. And I hung up. My hands were shaking. I set the phone on the counter and gripped the edge of the sink with both hands. The porcelain was cool and smooth. I stood there until my breathing leveled out. In 41 years of plumbing, I had opened thousands of access panels. Some revealed minor corrosion. Some revealed damage that had been spreading for years behind finished walls. You never know what you will find until you look. But you always know, from the sound, whether the person on the other side of the phone expected you to look. Karen did not expect me to look. 2 weeks later, Victoria called with the forensic accountant's preliminary findings. His name was Donald Pratt, based in Richmond. And he had obtained bank statements, trust account records, and transaction histories going back 19 months. "Mr. Bennett," Victoria said, "I want to walk you through the numbers. In the 14 months between the creation of the Family Living Trust and Margaret's death, Karen had made the following transfers. Your monthly pension deposit of $2,100 was rerouted from your personal account to the trust operating account. Total over 14 months, $29,400. Your Social Security payment of $1,780 per month was similarly redirected. Total, $24,920. The proceeds from the sale of your truck, which Karen told you was loaned to Troy, were deposited into a separate account in Charlotte. The sale price was $11,200. 3 withdrawals totaling $14,000 were made from the trust account to pay credit card balances in Karen and Troy's names, and a single transfer of $42,000 was made to a brokerage account held jointly by Karen and Troy. The total amount redirected from my accounts and assets was approximately $121,500. Victoria let that number sit for a moment. "There is one more item," she said. "The property taxes on your mother's house in Briar Hollow. $21,000 in back taxes." Karen listed this as an estate liability at the family meeting. Donald traced the tax records. The taxes were current until 2 years ago. Your mother paid them annually by cashier's check through the Briar Hollow post office. After your mother's death, no payments were made. Karen was notified by the county assessor's office 7 months ago. She did not pay. She did not inform you. She allowed the debt to accumulate and then presented it to you as evidence that the property was worthless. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the grocery receipt pinned to the wall. 3 dates, 3 filings, and now a set of numbers that told a story more clearly than any letter could. My daughter had not merely taken what I had. She had engineered the taking. She had used the documents I signed in grief as tools to disassemble my financial life piece by piece, the way you would disconnect a plumbing system. Cap the main line, reroute the branches, drain the reservoir, and when the system was empty, hand the owner a bill for the damage and walk away. But she had made one mistake. She had assumed the cabin was empty. She had assumed my mother was just an old woman in a falling-down house with unpaid taxes and a workshop full of dust. She had not gone inside. She had not walked down the stairs. She had not knocked on the floor. Victoria said the next step was a formal hearing. The judge would review the petition, the forensic report, and the demand for accounting. Karen would be required to appear or send legal representation. The hearing was scheduled for February 14th of the following year, Valentine's Day. The day Margaret used to leave a card on my nightstand before I woke up. I told Victoria. The date was fine. I hung up the phone, walked to the workshop, and descended the ladder into the vault. The climate control unit hummed. The cedar air was cool. I stood in front of the cherry wood shelves and looked at 340 glass cases, each one holding something my mother had chosen, authenticated, preserved, and hidden. Not from the world. From the one person she knew would come looking for it with the wrong intentions. She had known. 14 months before she died, she had tested Karen with a phone call, and Karen had failed. So Vivian sealed the hatch, wound the pocket watch, and waited for her son to find his way home. The months between June and February moved the way water moves through a pipe that has been shut off for a long time. Slow at first, stuttering, brown with rust and sediment, then gradually clearing until the flow runs steady and transparent, and you can see all the way through it. I spent those months doing three things: restoring the house, learning my mother's collection, and preparing for the hearing. The house came first because it was the thing I understood best. I replaced the broken window pane in the front bedroom with glass I cut myself in the workshop. I stripped the peeling paint from the porch boards, sanded them down to bare wood, and applied 2 coats of exterior stain the color of dark honey. I fixed the sag in the porch roof by sistering a new joist alongside the cracked original, the way you reinforce a weakened section of copper line by soldering a sleeve over the damaged joint. The sagging stopped. The roofline straightened. And every morning when I stepped outside with my coffee, the porch felt solid under my feet in a way that reminded me the foundation of this place was sound. It had always been sound. It just needed someone to do the work. Gus helped when I let him. He rebuilt the stone steps at the front walk and welded a new handrail from salvaged iron. His wife, Doris, brought food twice a week: cornbread, soup, once a blueberry pie that was so good I told her it was criminal. She laughed and said Vivian had given her the recipe 30 years ago. The collection was harder. Not physically. Physically, it was a matter of descending the ladder, putting on cotton gloves, and opening one glass case at a time. But each case contained something my mother had chosen with a level of care I was only beginning to understand. The 1,794 Earnshaw Marine chronometer had a movement so precise that Alistair Crowe told me it still kept time within 2 seconds per day after 230 years. A Breguet subscription watch from 1802 had a case of 18-karat gold with an enamel dial painted by hand, and a provenance card tracing its ownership through 4 families across 3 countries. There were American railroad watches from the 1880s, Swiss pocket chronometers from the 1920s, English carriage clocks with fusee movements. And in the center of the bottom shelf, in a case lined with burgundy velvet, a pair of matching cylinder watches made by Abraham Louis Breguet himself, dated 1796, each signed on the movement plate in a hand so fine you needed the loupe to read it. I began reading. Alistair Crowe lent me 2 reference volumes. I ordered 3 more from a bookshop in Roanoke. I sat at the kitchen table each evening and studied the history of mechanical timekeeping, the evolution of the escapement, the economics of scarcity, and the market dynamics of horological auctions. I learned that my mother had not simply collected beautiful objects. She had built a portfolio with the discipline of an engineer and the patience of someone who understood that the value of precision compounds over time. Every piece in that vault had been chosen for condition, rarity, provenance, and long-term appreciation. She had never sold a single one. In October, Victoria Ames called with a development. "Mr. Bennett, Karen's attorney has filed a counter-motion. They are arguing that you are mentally incapacitated, and that the power of attorney was signed voluntarily and with full understanding. They have submitted a statement from a physician in Charlotte who claims to have evaluated you. I have never seen a physician in Charlotte. I know. The evaluation is based on a telephone interview Karen arranged without your knowledge 5 months ago. She told the physician you were her elderly father experiencing confusion and memory loss following your wife's death. The physician documented the call as a clinical consultation. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger exactly. Something colder. The feeling you get when you open an access panel and find that someone has deliberately cross-connected the hot and cold lines. Not a mistake. A choice. Can they use that? I asked. They can submit it. Whether the judge gives it weight is another matter. A telephone evaluation arranged by the interested party without the subject's knowledge or consent has very limited credibility, but we should prepare a response. I want you to see a physician here in Virginia. A full cognitive evaluation. Independent. Documented. We put that on the record, and their telephone note becomes irrelevant. I agreed. The following week I drove to a clinic in Roanoke. A neuropsychologist named Dr. Eleanor Sims administered a 3-hour evaluation, memory tests, reasoning tests, language tests, pattern recognition, sequential problem solving. At the end, she told me my cognitive function was well above average for my age group and consistent with a person who had spent decades in a profession requiring spatial reasoning and systematic analysis. You think like an engineer, she said. Plumber, I said. She smiled. Same architecture, different pipes. Victoria filed the report with the court the same week. She also filed a motion to strike the Charlotte telephone evaluation on grounds that it was obtained without informed consent and did not meet the standard for a legitimate medical assessment. In December, Gus and I were sitting on the porch after a day of stacking firewood. The air was cold and sharp, and the stars were bright enough to cast faint shadows on the gravel. He asked me if I was ready for February. I told him I did not know. I told him that some mornings I woke up and felt steady, like the system was holding pressure. And other mornings I woke up and felt like every joint in the line was about to let go. I told him I kept thinking about Karen at 7 years old, sitting on the bathroom floor and watching me replace a faucet cartridge. She had asked me why I talked to the pipes. I told her I was listening to them. She had laughed and said, "Pipes do not talk, Daddy." I told Gus that was the part I could not make sense of. Not the money, not the documents, not the legal strategy. The distance between that little girl on the bathroom floor and the woman who had arranged a fraudulent medical evaluation to prove her father was losing his mind. Gus was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Harold, some people do not change. They just finally show you who they were building all along." I wound the pocket watch. The ticking was steady in the cold air. 60 days to the hearing. February 14th arrived. The way a pressure test arrives. You have checked every fitting. You have tightened every joint. You have filled the system and bled the air out of every high point. And then you open the valve, and either the system holds or it does not. There is no partial result. No, almost. The gauge reads pass or fail. Gus drove me to the courthouse in Charlottesville. We left Briar Hollow at 5:45 in the morning. The roads were dark, and the temperature was 26 degrees. Frost covered the windshield, and Gus let the truck idle for 10 minutes before we pulled out of the driveway. Neither of us spoke for the first hour. The heat rattled through the dashboard vents, and I held the pocket watch in my coat pocket, turning it slowly between my fingers the way I used to turn a compression nut before seating it. Victoria Ames met us in the lobby at 8:30. She wore a charcoal suit and carried a leather portfolio that I had seen her organize the previous week during our final preparation meeting. She looked at me and said, "You know your story. Just tell the truth and answer only what is asked." The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Wood-tammeled walls, fluorescent lights, an American flag behind the bench. 2 tables facing the judge. Victoria and I sat on the left. On the right sat Karen's attorney, a man named Philip Holt from a firm in Charlotte. He was maybe 45, cleniff-shaven, gray suit, and he arranged his papers with a precision that reminded me of how Karen arranged her colored folders at the family meeting. Karen sat behind him in the first row. She wore a navy blazer, and her hair was pulled back. She did not look at me. Troy sat beside her. He looked at the floor. The judge was the Honorable Ruth Calloway. She was perhaps 60, with reading glasses on a chain, and a manner that suggested she had heard every kind of story that desperate people bring to a courtroom, and had stopped being surprised a long time ago. She read the case summary aloud, identified both parties, confirmed the attorneys, and said, "Mr. Holt, you filed the counter motion. You may begin." Philip Holt stood and spoke for 12 minutes. He described Karen as a devoted daughter who had stepped in during a family crisis to manage her father's affairs. He said the power of attorney was signed voluntarily, and that Harold Bennett was an elderly man whose cognitive decline had accelerated following his wife's death. He referenced the telephone evaluation from the Charlotte physician. He argued that the irrevocable trust was irrelevant to the current matter because the petition concerned only the power of attorney and the family living trust. He asked the court to dismiss the petition and affirm Karen's authority as attorney of the Victoria stood and spoke for 9 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She did not use dramatic language. She presented 3 things. First, she submitted the forensic accountant's report. $121,500 redirected from Harold Bennett's accounts into accounts controlled by Karen and Troy. Pension payments rerouted. Social Security rerouted. Truck sold without Harold's knowledge. Credit card debts paid from trust funds. A $42,000 transfer to a personal brokerage account. And $21,000 in deliberately unpaid property taxes on a house Karen knew was held in an irrevocable trust benefiting her father. Second, she submitted the independent cognitive evaluation from Dr. Eleanor Sims, 3 hours of testing. Result: cognitive function, well above average. No evidence of decline, confusion, or incapacity. Victoria noted that the Charlotte telephone evaluation was conducted without Harold's knowledge or consent, arranged by the party with a financial interest in the outcome, and did not meet the minimum standard for a clinical assessment. Third, she played a recording. I did not know about the recording until that moment. Victoria had told me during our final preparation that she had one additional piece of evidence she would present at the hearing and that I should trust her. I did. The recording was a voicemail. Karen had left it on my phone 7 months earlier, the night after I hung up on her. I had forgotten about it. Victoria had not. During our first meeting, when I told her the full story, she had asked if Karen had ever contacted me directly. I told her about the phone call. She asked if there were any messages. I checked. There was one. 47 seconds. I played it for Victoria that day, and she had it authenticated and transcribed. The courtroom heard Karen's voice through a small speaker on Victoria's table. Dad, I do not know who is filling your head with this nonsense, but you need to stop. There is no trust. There is no collection. Grandma was a senile old woman living in a shack. The house is worthless. You signed the papers. You agreed to this. If you go through with this, I will make sure you end up in a facility where someone else makes your decisions for you. Call me back. The room was silent for 6 seconds after the recording ended. I counted because counting is what I do when I need to stay still. Judge Calloway removed her reading glasses. She looked at Philip Holt. She looked at Karen. Then she looked at the transcript in front of her. Mrs. Driscoll, she said. Is that your voice on the recording? Karen's attorney stood. Your Honor, my client does not need to answer that at this time. Sit down, Mr. Holt. The judge's voice was level but carried the kind of weight that does not need volume. I asked your client a direct question. Karen stood. Her hands were at her sides. Her fingers were straight. Yes, she said. That is my voice. The judge put her glasses back on and wrote something on the file. Then she read her preliminary ruling. The general power of attorney was revoked effective immediately on grounds of undue influence, compromised consent, and demonstrated breach of fiduciary duty. All assets in the family living trust were frozen pending a full accounting and restitution hearing. The telephone evaluation from Charlotte was stricken from the record, and the matter of financial restitution, including the $121,500 identified by the forensic accountant, was referred to a separate proceeding. She looked at Karen once more and said, Mrs. Driscoll, the language in that voicemail concerns me. Threatening to place a competent adult in a care facility to control their legal decisions is not a negotiating tactic. It is coercion. I will be noting that for the record. She closed the file and called the next case. Victoria gathered her documents. She shook my hand and said, The system held. I walked out of the courtroom, and Gus was waiting in the hallway with 2 paper cups of coffee. He handed me one without a word. We stood by the window and I looked at the February sky, pale and cold and perfectly clear. It was Valentine's Day. Margaret would have left a card on my nightstand. I reached into my coat pocket and felt the pocket watch, still warm, still ticking. The system held. Spring came to Chestnut Ridge Road the way it always does in the Blue Ridge. Slowly. 1 degree at a time. The frost pulled back from the gravel. The elm tree pushed out its first pale green leaves, and the creek at the bottom of the ridge, which had been silent under ice since December, began to move again. I heard it from the porch on the first morning of March and stood there with my coffee for a long time, listening to the sound of a system coming back to life. The restitution hearing took place in April. Victoria Ames presented the forensic accountant's full report. The court ordered Karen and Troy to return $121,500, plus interest, within 90 days. The family living trust was dissolved. My pension and Social Security deposits were restored to my personal account. The title to the truck, which Karen had sold to a dealership in Charlotte, was resolved through a cash-equivalent payment of $11,200. Karen's attorney filed no appeal. I did not attend the hearing. Victoria handled it. I stayed in Briar Hollow and spent the day sanding the workshop floor. In May, Alistair Crowe delivered the complete appraisal. 412 pages. Every piece catalogued, photographed, graded, and valued. The final number was $32.4 million. He sat at my kitchen table and walked me through the summary. 14 museum-grade pieces. 62 pieces, valued above $100,000 each. The 1,786 Thomas Mudge chronometer prototype alone was appraised at $4.2 million. He told me it was one of the most significant private horological collections in the United States, and that 3 auction houses had already contacted his office after hearing rumors through the trade. I told him I was not selling. He looked at me over his wire-rimmed glasses and said, "May I ask why?" I told him my mother had spent 60 years building this collection. She had never sold a piece. She had chosen each one with a purpose I was still trying to understand. Selling it would be like cutting a finished system apart for scrap. The value is not in the copper. The value is in the connections. He nodded and closed his briefcase. In June, I filed the paperwork to establish the Bennett Community Workshop. Victoria helped with the legal structure. It would be a non-profit, funded by a portion of the trust's investment returns, housed in my mother's workshop on Chestnut Ridge Road. The mission was simple. Free classes in mechanical repair, woodworking, basic plumbing, and electrical work for anyone in the county who wanted to learn. No tuition, no application. Just show up with your hands and a willingness to be taught. Gus agreed to teach the metalworking classes. He built a small forge in the yard behind the workshop, using river stone from the creek bed and a bellows he fabricated from an old truck hood. Doris organized the schedule and managed the enrollment list, which filled within 2 weeks. 43 names. 17 of them were under 25. I taught the plumbing classes on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, 8 students at a time. We started with copper pipe and solder. I showed them how to cut, clean, flux, and join. How to read the color of the flame. How to listen to the solder as it flows into the joint. How to test for leaks with patience instead of pressure. Most of them had never held a torch. Some of them had never held a tool. But they learned. One by one, joint by joint, they built something that held. In July, a letter arrived at the house. No return address. Handwritten. Postmarked Charlotte, North Carolina. I opened it at the kitchen table. It was from Troy. The letter was short, 1 page. He wrote that he wanted me to know he was sorry. He wrote that he had known what Karen was doing and had not stopped it. He wrote that he had told himself it was not his business because it was between father and daughter, but he knew that was a lie. He wrote that he and Karen had separated in March. He wrote that he was not asking for forgiveness because he did not think he had earned it. He wrote that he had seen a newspaper article about the Bennett Community Workshop, and that it reminded him of the first time he visited my house in Dayton, and I spent an hour showing him how the water heater worked. He said that was the only time his own father had never done something like that. I read the letter twice. I folded it and put it in the drawer beside my mother's 7-page letter. I did not write back. But I did not throw it away. Karen never contacted me. Not after the hearing. Not after the restitution order. Not after the workshop opened. Victoria told me that Karen had moved from Charlotte to a smaller city in South Carolina. She was still working as a CPA. She had not remarried. That was all Victoria knew, and all I asked. Some nights I think about her. Not the woman who handed me $52 and told me the cabin was all that was left. The girl. The 7-year-old on the bathroom floor who asked me why I talked to the pipes. I told her I was listening. She laughed. I still hear that laugh sometimes. Late at night, when the house is quiet, and the only sound is the ticking of the pocket watch on the nightstand. I do not know if she will ever call. I do not know if I want her to. But I leave the porch light on. Every night. The same way my mother left the hatch unlocked. Not because you expect someone to come, because you build the system so the door is open if they do. October now. The elm tree has turned gold. The workshop classes resume next week. Gus and I sit on the porch most evenings, drinking coffee, watching the light move across the ridge. He does not talk much. I do not either. We sit in the kind of silence that does not need to be filled, the way a finished system does not need to be explained. It simply works. Yesterday I wound the pocket watch. The back panel is closed now. The 6 numbers have done their job. But the ticking continues, steady and precise, the way my mother intended. I held it to my ear the way I held it on the first night in this house, when I had nothing but a suitcase, $52, and 5 words I did not understand. Wind it when you are ready. I was not ready then. I am now.